Nasir Khan, a 23-year-old man, sits down to dinner with his family in their modest home, chatting with his father, Salim Khan, about the upcoming school tournament. The next day, at school, some of his classmates invite him to a party downtown, promising a lively night with lots of girls. Eager for romance, Nasir quickly agrees to join in. Later, he brings up the party at the dinner table. His mother, Safar Khan, isn't thrilled about the idea of him going downtown for the party, but after a bit of hesitation, she gives in for Nasir's sake. That evening, dressed sharply for the night, Nasir waits excitedly for his friend Amir, who had promised to bring his brother's car so they could go to the party together. But Amir calls, sounding disappointed, saying he can't make it because the car is not available after all. Nasir feels let down but is still determined to attend. Quietly, he takes his father's taxi and heads to the downtown party on his own. Arriving downtown, Nasir realizes he doesn't actually know the street where the party is happening. Just then, two strangers get into his father's taxi, mistaking him for a cab driver. Nasir explains that he isn't on duty, but they insist, pressuring him to take them to their destination. Before things escalate, a police car arrives, and the officer notices the situation. Nasir tells the officer that these two passengers hopped into his taxi even though he's off for the night. The officer steps in and forces the strangers out of the car. Afterward, Nasir asks the police officers for directions to the party location. Just as he's about to head there, a young woman, Andrea Cornish, enters his taxi, requesting to go to the beach. Nasir mentions he's off duty, but when Andrea questions if he's really going to make her leave, he changes his mind. Since they're in Manhattan, Nasir decides to take her to a quiet riverbank. On the way, Andrea says she's thirsty and would like something to drink. Nasir pulls over at a nearby gas station, where he buys a bottle of beer for her and water for himself. As Andrea waits in the car, a tall, black man, Mr. Day, who is a hearse driver, notices her smoking and warns her not to light up there. But Andrea brushes him off. Nasir and Andrea arrive at the riverbank, where Andrea opens up about her recent breakup, sharing how alone she feels. She encourages Nasir to take a drug pill with her to escape for the night. At first, Nasir hesitates, but Andrea reminds him that she doesn't want to be alone tonight. Finally, he agrees and takes the pill. Afterward, they head to Andrea's apartment. On their way inside, two strangers, one named Trevor, throw insults at Nasir, calling him an Arab killer and warning Andrea to stay away from him. Ignoring them, Andrea insists that Nasir come inside with her, brushing off the men's rude comments. Inside, they begin drinking together, each drink loosening them up more. Andrea, feeling bold, challenges Nasir to play a risky knife game where she stabs the space between her fingers. She goes first, stabbing the knife quickly between fingers. Then she asks Nasir to try. Though reluctant, he gives in and tries the game, pressing the knife between his own fingers as she watches, entertained. Now, Andrea raises the stakes, wanting him to do it with her hand. Nasir, after taking another drink, picks up the knife again and, trying to be careful, aims between Andrea's fingers. This time, though, the knife slips, piercing her palm slightly. Instead of recoiling, Andrea seems even more excited by the thrill, and, with their inhibitions gone, the two begin to make out passionately. After some time, Nasir wakes up in the kitchen, confused and unsure of the time. Realizing it's very late, he quickly puts on his socks and boots, deciding to leave. Heading to the bedroom to gather his belongings, he finds the room in darkness. He calls out for Andrea, but there's no response. Switching on the lamp, he's shocked to see Andrea lying in bed, covered in blood, brutally murdered. Panic grips him, and without a second thought, he runs out of the apartment. Outside, Nasir searches his pockets for the taxi keys, only to remember they're still in his jacket, which is inside the apartment. Frustrated but desperate, he goes back to retrieve it, only to find the door locked from the inside. Forced to act, he breaks the door glass to get back in, unknowingly catching the attention of a neighbor watching from his window. Nasir grabs his jacket and, while preparing to leave, notices the knife on the table. Fearing it might link him to the scene, he impulsively tucks it into his jacket pocket before fleeing in his taxi. In his panic, he drives recklessly, still under the influence of the drugs, attracting the attention of a patrolling police car. The officers pull him over, asking him to step out of the car. Nasir is nervous but tries to keep his composure as he speaks with them. Just as they prepare to give him a breathalyzer test, a call comes over the radio about a break-in nearby. Taking Nasir along, The officers drive to the reported address. As they near the location, Nasir's anxiety spikes because it's the same street where Andrea's apartment is. At the scene, the neighbor who saw him break in is there, talking to the police. He describes a young man entering the apartment, then quickly leaving in a taxi, though he didn't get a clear view of the man's face in the darkness. The police officers call their superior, Sergeant Dennis Box, to the scene. When he arrives and they inspect the apartment, they discover Andrea's body lying lifeless in her bed. Curious about Nasir, Box asks the officers why he was brought to the scene. They explain that Nasir had been driving erratically, so they stopped him for a sobriety test, but the break-in call came in, so they brought him along. Box instructs them to take Nasir to the precinct on a DUI charge and to release him afterward. Meanwhile, Box and the other officers continue examining the apartment. As Box exits, Trevor, the man from earlier, approaches the officers, loudly accusing the Arab of killing Andrea. Box, interested in his claims, calls Trevor over and questions him further, then instructs him to come down to the precinct to provide a full statement. At the precinct, Nasir is told to sit on a bench. Anxious, he considers leaving but stops when he spots Box approaching. He quickly sits back down, hoping to avoid attention. As an officer prepares to release him, she conducts a routine search and finds a knife covered in blood in Nasir's jacket pocket, which is the same type as the one used in Andrea's murder. Nasir is immediately alarmed, panicking as he insists that he had nothing to do with the murder. Distressed, he tries to make a run for it, but the officers quickly restrain him and place him under arrest. Box takes Nasir to the interrogation room and introduces himself, but Nasir continues to insist that he didn't commit the murder. He explains everything to Box, claiming that when he woke up in the kitchen, Andrea was already dead in her bed. Meanwhile, a small-time lawyer named John Stone, who was there to help a prostitute, hears about Nasir from an officer. When the officer tells him Nasir is a murder suspect, Stone offers to represent him. Stone asks Nasir if the police mistreated him in any way, but Nasir says no. However, when Stone learns that Detective Box is in charge of Nasir's case, he becomes visibly concerned because Box has a reputation for being sharp and incredibly cunning. At the same time, Nasir's parents are very worried since he hasn't returned home all night. Stone arranges a call between Nasir and his parents, during which Nasir tells them he's been arrested as a murder suspect but insists that he didn't kill anyone. Hearing this, his father, Salim, immediately prepares to go to the police station, but as he steps outside, he realizes their car is missing. Salim and Safar reach the police station in a rush, visibly anxious about their son's situation. Stone meets with them, carefully explaining everything that has happened so far. He tells them that he is ready to represent Nasir as his lawyer, and he assures them that he will thoroughly study every aspect of the case to give Nasir the best possible defense. Stone also points out that staying at the police station won't be helpful at this stage, as no formal charges have been filed yet. He promises to notify them immediately if there are any updates or changes in Nasir's case. Then Salim and Safar finally meet with Nasir. He explains the events in detail. He tells them he absolutely didn't commit the murder, even though he admits he was in Andrea's apartment. Nasir explains that he panicked when he saw Andrea's body and picked up the knife out of fear. He insists he's innocent and would never be capable of such a crime. As Nasir talks, Detective Box watches closely through a camera, observing every word exchanged between Nasir and his parents. Later, Stone meets with Nasir in a private conversation, advising him strongly to avoid talking to anyone about the case, especially Detective Box. Stone warns him that everything he says can be recorded and potentially used against him in court. When Nasir mentions that he already spoke with his parents, Stone becomes visibly frustrated, emphasizing how crucial it is to stay silent. He instructs Nasir to respond to any questions with a firm comment of "talk to my lawyer" and to say nothing else that could complicate his situation. Meanwhile, Box returns to Andrea's apartment, meticulously searching for anything that could strengthen his case. During his search, he finds Nasir's asthma inhaler, which he takes back to the precinct. Back at the station, Box attempts to persuade Nasir to confess, trying various tactics to get him to admit to the murder. He pressures Nasir, hoping he'll break under interrogation. Despite the intense questioning, Nasir remains silent, refusing to admit to anything. Frustrated by Nasir's silence, Box decides to move forward and officially files homicide charges against him. The next day, Stone is at home, preparing for his day. As he knots his tie, his wife arrives to pick up their son. Noticing his unusually neat appearance, she comments on the tie, curious about the change. Stone, clearly excited, shares that he has taken on a high-stakes murder case, a significant opportunity for him. His wife, although surprised, wishes him luck, giving him a few words of encouragement before she leaves with their son. Meanwhile, Box meets with the public prosecutor, Helen, expressing his confidence in the case against Nasir. He emphasizes that it's an open and shut case, insisting that Nasir is the one who committed the murder. Box believes the evidence is clear and expects a swift verdict in just one hearing. As the court proceedings begin, Nasir is brought into the courtroom, feeling a mix of anxiety and fear. The judge starts questioning him, asking if he went to Andrea's apartment that night. Nasir confirms, saying yes, but when the judge brings up the murder, Nasir quickly asserts his innocence, declaring he did not commit the crime and is not guilty. Stone, Nasir's lawyer, files a bail appeal, arguing passionately for his client. He points out that Nasir is a business student with no prior offenses and no passport, suggesting he has no reason to flee. However, Helen's assistant opposes the bail, arguing that the severity of the charges should weigh heavily against granting it. Stone pushes hard, pleading for a chance to allow Nasir to remain free while awaiting trial. Unfortunately, the judge considers the gravity of the situation and denies the bail request, stating that Nasir must be held due to the nature of the crime. With a heavy heart, Nasir watches as the judge orders him to be transported to prison. He feels a wave of despair wash over him as he is led away, knowing he will be placed in a cell with other prisoners. In prison, Freddy, a notorious criminal, oversees daily activities and manages the underground dealings within its walls. He has a girlfriend who works as a police officer, and together, they smuggle drugs and other contraband into the facility. Freddy's influence makes him a significant figure among inmates, allowing him to maintain control over the illicit activities. When Nasir arrives at the prison, the warden explains the rules and regulations, emphasizing the consequences for breaking them. The strict environment makes Nasir anxious, and he fears the potential punishments that could await him for any missteps. Freddy notices Nasir and shows interest in him, sending a message through a guard to meet him. However, Nasir declines the invitation, feeling overwhelmed by the situation and the atmosphere of intimidation. Meanwhile, Stone visits Salim and Safar to discuss the case. He informs them that his fee for representing Nasir is $75,000. Salim is taken aback by the amount, feeling the weight of the financial burden. Stone tries to justify his fee, explaining that lawyers handling murder cases charge accordingly due to the stakes involved. He offers a possibility of reducing the fee to $50,000 if they can reach a settlement before trial. Salim, frustrated, argues that he does not see Nasir as a murderer and feels uneasy about paying such a large sum, especially since their financial situation is tight. He mentions that he only has $8,000 in his bank account, and their taxi is currently in police custody. He highlights that the taxi belongs to a partnership, with the other two drivers not being in good financial standing either. As the discussion intensifies, Salim expresses his disappointment, revealing the emotional toll this situation is taking on him. He pleads for Stone to understand their circumstances, but ultimately, Stone insists that $50,000 is the best offer he can provide. He tells them that if they are willing to accept this amount, they should sign the agreement. Otherwise, Stone reluctantly states he cannot proceed with the case. This ultimatum leaves Salim and Safar in a tough spot, wrestling with their options as they consider Nasir's future. The two taxi shareholders, Yusuf and Tariq, meet with Salim at a restaurant to discuss their taxi, which is still in the police custody. During their conversation, Salim shares the troubling news that his son, Nasir, is currently in prison. Yusuf and Tariq, understanding the weight of this situation, express their full support for Salim. Meanwhile, Allison, a prominent lawyer running a respected law firm, has taken an interest in Nasir's case. She sees it covered on television, where police officers are giving updates to the public about the ongoing investigation. They stress that the case is still under investigation, and they cannot reveal any details at this point. Stone is present during this press conference and steps forward to challenge the narrative being portrayed by the police. He tells a camera crew that he is Nasir's lawyer and adamantly disputes the police's claims. Stone argues that Nasir is a dedicated student who would never commit such a crime. He assures the public that they will present compelling evidence in court to prove Nasir's innocence. Allison, after reviewing the details of the case, instructs her assistant to gather all the information related to Nasir's situation. Once her assistant compiles the necessary details, Allison calls Chandra, a junior lawyer at her firm who speaks Urdu, into her office. She asks Chandra about her proficiency in the language. Chandra responds modestly, mentioning she can speak a little bit of Urdu, which brings a smile to Allison's face. Recognizing the importance of connecting with Nasir's family, they decide to visit them at their home. At Nasir's house, they meet Salim and Safar. Seeing an Urdu-speaking lawyer puts Safar at ease, and she feels more hopeful about their situation. Allison explains to them that she is ready to take on Nasir's case. Salim mentions that they already have Stone representing them, but Allison expresses concerns about Stone's credibility. She points out that he often takes on dubious cases, like those involving drunk driving and prostitution, and doesn't fight hard for his clients. She warns that the fees for those kinds of cases are typically much lower than what Nasir's case demands, emphasizing that they might end up paying double or triple in this situation. Allison offers to take on the case pro bono, which means free of cost, which surprises Salim. When Salim asks Allison why she would offer her services for free, she explains that her foundation is dedicated to helping those who cannot afford legal representation. This mission resonates with Salim, and he agrees to let her take the case. He confides in her that he had a bad feeling about Stone from the beginning, noting that Stone had been fixated on settling the case rather than fighting for justice. Meanwhile, Stone arrives at the murder scene, keen to capture evidence. He begins filming a video to document the surroundings and gather material that may prove useful later. While exploring the area, he encounters a cat near the back door. Amused, he decides to fetch some milk from the fridge to feed cat. Back at the prison, Nasir receives a phone call from Salim. Salim shares the news about changing their lawyer and informs him that Allison will be taking on his case. However, Nasir doesn't take the news well and expresses his disappointment. He had developed a trust with Stone and felt comfortable with him. Salim tries to reassure him, insisting that Stone is merely a greedy man focused on making money rather than genuinely caring about Nasir's case. He urges Nasir to trust Allison's intentions, explaining that her foundation aims to help people in dire situations like theirs. Despite Salim's reassurances, Nasir remains skeptical and uneasy about the changes being made. Stone visits Nasir in prison, only to be caught off guard by Nasir's revelation that he is no longer his lawyer. Hearing this news leaves Stone visibly shocked, but without a word, he turns and walks away, digesting the unexpected change in silence. Meanwhile, Yusuf and Tariq go to the police station to inquire about retrieving the taxi. They are informed that the vehicle won't be released until Nasir's case is resolved, which could take a lengthy 7 to 8 months given the complexities of a murder trial. This leaves them stunned. Noticing their distress, the officer suggests a possible workaround. He explains that if they press a theft charge against Nasir, it might allow for an early release of the taxi, as Nasir had taken the vehicle without his father's permission. To strengthen their case, the officer hands them Stone's business card, suggesting they could consider him as a lawyer to handle this matter. Yusuf and Tariq are conflicted by the officer's advice but decide to discuss it with Salim. When they bring up the idea of accusing Nasir of theft, Salim reacts with fury. He refuses to tarnish his son's reputation further, arguing that a father accusing his own child of theft is unthinkable. However, Yusuf and Tariq plead with Salim, pointing out that the taxi is their only source of income. They argue that since Nasir is already facing a serious murder charge, an additional theft accusation might not make much of a difference in his situation. Salim, still angry, rejects the idea outright and storms off, unwilling to compromise his son's dignity in this way. Meanwhile, Freddy, who controls various underground activities in the prison, calls Nasir to his cell. He warns Nasir that prison is a dangerous place, especially for someone who isn't familiar with the harsh environment. Freddy offers Nasir protection but is politely declined. Returning to his bed, Nasir shares the interaction with another prisoner, who reacts with alarm. He explains that refusing Freddy's offers can have serious consequences and advises Nasir to accept whatever Freddy offers to avoid trouble. However, Nasir chooses to ignore the advice and leaves to use the restroom. When Nasir returns to his bed, he is horrified to find his mattress set ablaze. The sight of the flames and the clear message it sends fills him with fear, making him realize that Freddy's warning was not to be taken lightly. Stone feels disheartened by losing Nasir's case, sensing the weight of missed responsibility. He receives a call about a new case involving a student's fight with a barber over something. Stone quickly states his $250 fee, instructing the caller to wait. Later, while watching Nasir's home being broadcast live on the news, his thoughts drift back to Nasir's case. He decides to attend Andrea's funeral ceremony, hoping to gather more information. At the funeral, Stone tries engaging with Andrea's friends, attempting to extract any useful insights. However, Box arrives and, seeing Stone's intentions, announces to the group that Stone was Nasir's former lawyer. This revelation causes Andrea's friends to leave abruptly. Box then sternly warns him to stay away from the case, making it clear that his presence is unwanted. Box, satisfied with his intervention, departs, leaving Stone alone. Just as Stone is about to leave as well, he notices Mr. Taylor, Andrea's stepfather, embroiled in a heated argument near Andrea's grave with Andrea's financial advisor Mr. Ray. Curious, Stone discreetly records the confrontation, sensing it might hold vital information. Later, while reviewing Andrea's old photos, Stone discovers a potential clue, leading him to visit Andrea's psychologist's house. When the psychologist notices him taking photos outside, she confronts him, firmly demanding that he leave or she'll call the police. Stone reluctantly moves away, respecting her warning. However, a little later, her assistant approaches Stone discreetly and, after a brief conversation, offers him valuable information about Andrea in exchange for a fee. Stone agrees, and the assistant shares Andrea's psychological details through a mobile phone, offering glimpses into her life and mindset that Stone believes might be crucial to understanding the truth behind her death. Allison meets with Nasir, briefing him on the details of his case and explaining her approach for the upcoming hearing. Meanwhile, Stone connects with Chandra and agrees to share everything he's uncovered about Andrea, with plans to exchange critical case insights with a price. At the next court hearing, Allison appears as Nasir's representative, attempting to reapply for his bail. She argues that Nasir's previous lawyer, Stone, was unsuitable for handling such a complex case and that her involvement now should justify reconsidering his bail. However, the judge remains unmoved, citing his earlier decision to deny bail, which will stand despite the change in representation. Stone, present in the courtroom, feels disheartened and embarrassed by the Allison's remarks. After the hearing, Nasir is returned to prison, adjusting slowly to life inside. He begins forming a friendship with Calvin, a fellow inmate. Calvin, sensing Nasir's unease, advises him on surviving the prison environment, explaining who to avoid and what dangers to be mindful of. Calvin shares his own story, revealing he's in prison because he killed a man who had assaulted and murdered his niece. Despite Calvin's attempts to get justice through the legal system, the man evaded punishment and, on the very night of his freedom, he was seen celebrating at a bar. Enraged, Calvin took matters into his own hands and shot the man. Allison meets with Helen, the prosecutor, to discuss a plea deal. Allison proposes a sentence of 10 years, highlighting Nasir's clean background and young age. Helen, however, insists on a life sentence. Allison counters by suggesting 15 years, arguing that, if the case goes to trial, Nasir's chances are strong. Reluctantly, Helen finally agrees to the 15-year plea as Allison prepares to leave, acknowledging the proposal. Later, Allison meets Nasir and explains the deal. If the case goes to trial, the risk of a conviction is high. By accepting the plea, Nasir would face 15 years instead of life. Allison advises him to plead guilty to avoid harsher sentencing. Nervous, Nasir asks for time to think, and Allison, understanding the pressure he's under, warns him this deal is likely his best option. Meanwhile, Helen updates Box, telling him about the agreement with Allison. Box, however, doubts whether Nasir will accept the plea. In prison, Nasir meets with Chandra, seeking her perspective. He asks what she would do in his position. Chandra, empathetic but firm, responds that she wouldn't plead guilty to a crime she didn't commit. Nasir grows more conflicted, torn between survival and his principles. At the next hearing, Stone attends and privately urges Nasir to take the plea. He argues that Nasir can still have a life outside prison by accepting the 15-year sentence, reminding him that he'll be free by 35. Stone's push intensifies Nasir's internal struggle, as he wrestles with whether to accept the plea or risk a trial. The judge arrives, and Nasir, under oath, begins recounting the events of that fateful night. When Helen asks him directly about what happened, Nasir carefully describes his actions, explaining that he remembers waking up in the kitchen. He explains how, as he went to find Andrea, he was horrified to discover her already dead. Helen, visibly confused and probing for more, presses Nasir, directly asking if he had killed Andrea. Nasir, unwavering, insists that he did not kill her. This statement shocks Allison as she wasn't expecting him to make such a direct denial in court. Desperate to discuss it with him and perhaps steer him differently, Allison tries to talk to him, but Nasir dismisses her. She manages to catch up with him and, frustrated, tells him that his decision was rash, throwing away the chance of freedom. She emphasizes that by refusing the plea deal, he's now facing the harshest potential outcomes. She warns him that the jury, hearing only the prosecution's narrative, may be inclined to see him as guilty. Meanwhile, Chandra, recognizing the escalating stakes, speaks with Nasir's parents, explaining that with Nasir's refusal to accept the plea deal, Allison is now occupied with her other cases and has decided that Chandra will be taking over his defense. She assures them of her commitment to Nasir's case, though she knows the complexities and risks now involved. In prison, Nasir confides in Calvin about his decision to seek justice through the trial, expressing his hope that truth will ultimately prevail. Calvin, skeptical and hardened by his own experiences, is dismissive. He warns Nasir that everyone in prison has a similar mentality, that seeking forgiveness or assuming they'll somehow be released, despite their actions. He voices his low opinion of Nasir, calling him both a murderer and a rapist, and in a fit of anger, throws a harsh liquid at Nasir. Though Nasir manages to shield his face, his arms are burned in the process. When questioned by the warden about who attacked him, Nasir chooses silence, claiming it was too dark to identify anyone. As he exits the infirmary, he catches Calvin smirking mockingly at him, only fueling Nasir's anger. Determined to find safety, Nasir goes straight to Freddie, requesting his protection. Freddie, seeing this as an opportunity, agrees and accepts Nasir into his circle of allies within the prison. The next day, as Stone approaches his home, he finds Chandra waiting for him on his doorstep. Surprised but intrigued, he invites her inside. Once seated, Chandra explains that Allison has handed her Nasir's case, and now she needs Stone's help to make any headway. Stone, with a hardened expression, tells her he'll help only if she can manage to pay him $50,000. Shocked, Chandra mentions that the firm has only allocated $20,000 for her expenses and case investigation. Stone, seeing her predicament, pushes her to secure an additional $35,000. Finally, they settle on a compromise, $25,000. Reluctantly, he agrees to assist her. Meanwhile, Helen is visibly furious and meets with Box to go over every charge they can press against Nasir. The two, stepping outside for a quick cigarette, discuss the situation more openly. Helen, glancing at Box, asks if he's really retiring, hinting at disbelief. Box, with a faint smile, tells her he's been on the force for 33 years and feels it's finally time to leave. Helen, however, scoffs, suggesting that he may not have much going for him outside of the police force. Helen gives him a crucial task that she wants every detail from the night where Nasir left his house to right up until his arrest, documented in a complete report. Box nods in agreement, understanding the importance of this information to the case. Determined to leave no stone unturned, Helen and Box start meticulously reviewing the case from scratch. They examine all available CCTV footage, observing each detail and timeline, to ensure nothing is missed. The meticulous review marks the beginning of their renewed commitment to build a strong case against Nasir, aiming to cover every angle that might reveal new insights or evidence. Meanwhile, Stone pretends to be a police officer and approaches Cuddy, a low-level drug dealer who works as a waiter at a restaurant. Stone questions him about whether Andrea contacted him the night she died. Cuddy hesitates initially, but after Stone pressures him, he admits that Andrea did call him, asking for drugs, which he provided. He insists that he knows nothing beyond that and doesn't offer any further details. Following this lead, Stone suggests to Chandra that they hire a private forensic expert, pressing her to bring in someone who might uncover overlooked evidence that could impact the case. Chandra, despite her reservations, agrees, realizing the importance of a fresh perspective. Together, they visit Andrea's apartment with a forensic expert, who meticulously examines every detail, leaving no stone unturned. The expert documents everything in sight, carefully photographing even the smallest pieces of evidence and analyzing the scene from every possible angle. Meanwhile, Helen meets with Trevor to dig deeper into what he witnessed that night. She asks him about his observations, and Trevor explains that as he was passing by Andrea's apartment, he saw her entering with Nasir. He mentions that he tried to warn Andrea, but she ignored him and continued inside with Nasir. Helen then questions him on what he was doing there so late at night. With a shrug, Trevor defensively replies that it's a free country, and he can go wherever he pleases. Helen, taken aback, says nothing further, and Trevor leaves without adding more. Each of these encounters adds layers to the case, leaving both Helen and Stone with fragmented clues that could tip the balance either way. Meanwhile, Helen meets with the government forensic expert, asking if the cut on Nasir's hand could have come from the same knife used in Andrea's murder. The expert initially seems uncertain, suggesting it might have been caused by breaking the main gate's glass. But at Helen's insistence, he eventually states that the wound is indeed consistent with a knife cut, not something from glass. Helen instructs him to be clear and confident in his statement when he testifies in court, setting the stage for a strong prosecution argument. In prison, Freddie brings Nasir to the washroom, where they find Calvin lying injured on the floor. Freddie urges Nasir to take the opportunity and attack Calvin, pressuring him to prove his strength. Nasir initially kicks Calvin once and begins to walk away, but Calvin taunts him, questioning his power. This remark ignites Nasir's anger, and he returns to deliver a brutal beating to Calvin, losing control as he repeatedly hits him. Eventually, one of Freddie's men steps in to stop Nasir. Freddie later tells Nasir he acted like a true beast and reveals that Calvin is now in the ICU due to the severity of his injuries. Hearing this, Nasir falls silent, clearly shaken. In a symbolic act, he shaves his head, embracing the hardened prison identity he is slowly adopting. Having gained Freddie's approval, Nasir is now treated as a close ally. Freddie calls him to his cell, introducing him to Petey and explaining his responsibility to protect him. Freddie shares that Petey is struggling with a drug addiction, and he entrusts Nasir with a new task to smuggle drugs into the prison for Petey. Freddie explains that Petey's mother will supply the drugs, packaged in small balls, and Petey will hand them off to Nasir. Though initially reluctant, Nasir ultimately agrees under Freddie's intense pressure. To prepare him, Freddie gives Nasir a grapefruit to practice swallowing the drug packets, beginning his initiation into prison smuggling. The next day, when Stone and Chandra visit Nasir in prison, Stone can't help but comment on Nasir's shaved head, saying he wishes Nasir hadn't done it as it might give the jury a bad impression. Nasir, however, brushes off his comment, his focus now entirely on Petey and the risky task ahead. Soon, Petey discreetly hands Nasir the drug-filled balls he received from his mother. Nasir starts swallowing them one by one, struggling with each as the task proves far more difficult than he expected. Both Stone and Chandra notice his discomfort but continue their conversation to keep the guards from growing suspicious. During this tense moment, Stone questions Nasir about the night he went to Andrea's place, particularly about the stranger who threw him off guard. Nasir clarifies that he actually encountered two men, not one, which contradicts Trevor's testimony that he was alone that night. Stone, surprised, tells him they'll need to address this contradiction with Trevor. As Nasir finally manages to swallow all the drug packets, he signals a prison officer to take him back to his cell. Determined to complete the risky mission, Stone warns him to stay cautious and avoid getting caught, emphasizing that if anything goes wrong, they won't be able to protect him. He tells Nasir that one mistake could end the case and destroy any remaining chance he has. Back in his cell, Nasir works to release the drug packets, eventually managing to pass them without incident. Freddie is impressed by his performance and congratulates him, acknowledging Nasir's success and his growing acceptance within the prison's hierarchy. This marks a significant shift in Nasir's life, as he is now navigating a dangerous line, earning respect but at a substantial personal cost. Meanwhile, Stone finds himself in an intense conversation with Trevor, pressing him for details about his activities on the night of Andrea's death. Trevor, visibly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, insists that he was alone. Stone, however, remains resolute, warning Trevor that his evasive behavior could lead to serious consequences, including arrest for lying to the police. The weight of this threat begins to sink in, prompting Trevor to reluctantly disclose that he was actually with a friend named Dwayne that night, though he seems eager to avoid any further discussion about it. Stone shares this newfound information with Chandra, who listens intently. She cautions him that Trevor might be trying to mislead them to protect himself from any legal repercussions. Chandra stresses the importance of keeping Trevor away from the police to prevent him from worsening his own situation. Stone nods in agreement, realizing the nature of their investigation and the risks they face in dealing with potential witnesses. As soon as Chandra hangs up the phone, Stone springs into action, determined to track down Dwayne, believing he could hold crucial information that might help their case. He recalls the vague description Trevor provided and quickly heads out to the area where he might find Dwayne. Upon arriving at a local general store, Stone spots Dwayne sitting with a group of friends, laughing and playing cards, seemingly oblivious to the urgency of Stone's mission. Gathering his thoughts, Stone approaches him, ready to ask Dwayne some pointed questions about that fateful night. However, as he starts to engage, Dwayne's demeanor shifts dramatically. The moment he realizes that Stone is asking serious questions, Dwayne, sensing the growing tension, suddenly bolts from his seat, slipping away from Stone's grasp in a frantic attempt to evade confrontation. However, Stone instinctively takes off after him, weaving through the crowd and dodging tables as he pursues Dwayne. But despite Stone's best efforts, Dwayne manages to slip out and disappear from sight. Stone comes to a halt, frustration boiling within him. He knows that this encounter could have led to critical insights into the case, and now he's left with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Safar attends a job interview, her nerves palpable as she sits across from the interviewer. She confidently shares her experience as a sales manager in her previous job, hoping to impress. When asked about her relationship with Nasir, her expression shifts slightly. With a hint of hesitation, she admits that she is indeed Nasir's mother, a fact that seems to weigh heavily on her. The interviewer raises an eyebrow, noting that this connection may have contributed to her departure from her last position. In a surprising turn, the interviewer offers her a janitor position instead, a role far removed from her previous responsibilities. While it isn't what she envisioned for herself, Safar recognizes that any job is better than none and accepts the offer, determined to make the best of it. Meanwhile, Chandra is engrossed in analyzing CCTV footage, searching for any clues that could shed light on the case. Suddenly, she spots a hearse driver, Mr. Day, who seems to be watching Andrea closely at the gas station. Chandra notes that as Andrea and Nasir pass by, the driver shifts his attention, almost following them discreetly. Intrigued, Chandra begins to piece together the connection, realizing that the driver's behavior could be significant. She decides to gather more information about him. Determined to learn more, Chandra visits the office of Day, presenting her identification card and introducing herself. At first, Day seems reluctant to engage, brushing off her questions. However, as the conversation progresses, he mentions having seen Andrea at a gas station the day she died, where she had been smoking. When Chandra presses him further, he makes a chilling remark, implying that he already knew about Andrea's fate. This unsettling comment raises alarm bells for Chandra, who feels the tension in the air. She quickly gathers herself, realizing she needs to report this back to Stone. Meeting with him later, she shares the day's strange insights, including his assertion that women like Andrea often meet tragic ends. Stone, alarmed by the implications, urges her to be cautious. He reminds her that they need to tread carefully, especially given the sensitive nature of their investigation. Concerned for her safety, Stone insists that Chandra should not go alone to confront any potential witnesses or suspects again. Instead, he suggests they take a break and have a meal at a local restaurant. He believes it will help clear their heads and give them a moment to regroup. As they settle into the restaurant, Stone orders some food for both of them, hoping to lighten the mood. Chandra, still shaken by the encounter with Day, appreciates his support, knowing they both need to stay strong and focused as they continue their investigation into Andrea's tragic death. Meanwhile, in the precinct, as Box investigates Nasir's previous life, he stumbles upon Nasir's Facebook profile. While scrolling through it, he discovers that during Nasir's childhood, he changed schools. What catches Box's attention is the fact that the old school was only a 5-minute walking distance away, but he had to travel a whopping 40 minutes by train or metro to get to the new school. So he questions himself that why Nasir changes his school in the first palace. This revelation surprises him, raising some questions about Nasir's past. Curious to learn more, Box decides to meet with the old school sports coach. The coach informs him that there was an incident where Nasir attacked another student. This attack resulted in significant injuries to the child, which led the parents of the other boy to demand Nasir's expulsion from the school. Box is shocked to hear this as it paints a different picture of Nasir than he had imagined. When Box shares this information with Stone, he is particularly shocked, as this kind of behavior had not been mentioned before. He realizes that he needs to dig deeper into Nasir's history to understand what led to these violent actions. Meanwhile, Chandra meets with Nasir, and as she discusses the details of his past, he opens up about the bullying he faced after the events of 9/11 in America. Nasir explains how the atmosphere for Muslim children drastically changed during that time, causing a lot of pain and suffering. He recalls how the other kids bullied and tortured him relentlessly, leading to a situation where he eventually lost control of his anger. One day, after being pushed too far, he retaliated against one of his tormentors, a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Chandra is preparing her opening statement, focused and ready to present her case. Just as she is about to finalize her notes, the doorbell rings, breaking her concentration. It turns out to be a food delivery rider, who is actually Salim. He has come to deliver her food. As Salim discusses the charges for the delivery, Chandra quickly heads to grab her purse from another room. When she returns to the door, she finds that Salim has already placed the food on the doorstep and has left. Meanwhile, Stone calls Chandra to check in on her progress with the opening statements. Chandra informs him that she is currently engaged in preparing her notes. Stone expresses his willingness to come over and help her, but Chandra firmly declines, insisting that she can manage on her own. Despite Stone's attempts to emphasize the importance of the opening statements, Chandra remains resolute, choosing to ignore his concerns. She feels confident that she can handle the task at hand without his assistance. In the prison, when Nasir returns to his cell, Freddy surprises him by offering him some clothes to wear for his court appearance. However, Nasir politely refuses Freddy, saying that his mother has already sent him the clothes. He insists that he is fine and thanks Freddy for this gesture. When Nasir arrives at the courthouse, Stone sees him wearing his attire and becomes frustrated. He expresses his annoyance at Nasir and says to him that always wear a white shirt, as he believes that wearing white gives an impression of innocence to the jury. In an effort to help, Stone quickly hands Nasir his own shirt and urges him to change before he appears in front of the judge. Helen steps up as the public prosecutor, ready to deliver her opening statement. She captures the jury's attention by showcasing Andrea's old photos, illustrating the life she once lived. Helen emphasizes the tragic events surrounding Andrea's death, detailing how Nasir inflicted 22 cuts on her before ultimately killing her. The jury is visibly moved as they view the emotional images of Andrea, reflecting on the loss of life. Helen then transitions into her case, calling her witnesses to the stand. The first piece of evidence presented is a CCTV footage clip. The jury watches closely as the footage reveals Nasir forcing two passengers out of the taxi, but he allows Andrea into the same vehicle. Helen highlights how Nasir's actions were not just reckless but intentional. Next, she brings in a police officer to testify, demonstrating that they helped Nasir into forcing those passengers out of his taxi. Then, Helen calls forth a shopkeeper who confirms that Nasir purchased beer and a water bottle from his store on the night of Andrea's murder. The shopkeeper identifies Nasir as the person who bought the beer. Following this, a forensic expert takes the stand, confirming that the beer bottle only bears Andrea's fingerprints. Helen argues that this indicates Nasir did not drink the beer, suggesting premeditation in his actions. She underscores the fact that Nasir was fully aware of his intentions when he approached Andrea. Next, Helen summons the police officer who initially stopped Nasir for reckless driving. The officer explains that they pulled Nasir over but had no complaints lodged against him at the time. This further establishes a timeline for Nasir's actions that night. Meanwhile, Stone discusses the case with Chandra, brainstorming strategies for their defense. He expresses concern and curiosity about Andrea's financial advisor, Ray, and decides to meet him to gather more information. During their conversation, Ray reveals that Andrea's mother had transferred the apartment into Andrea's name shortly before her passing. This decision caused tension with Andrea's stepfather Taylor, who was not pleased with the arrangement. Ray explains that Andrea's stepfather disapproved of her choices and had no intention of supporting her financially. Stone is taken aback by this revelation. Ray continues, recounting how Andrea had refused her stepfather's offer to take part in the apartment after her mother passed away, stating clearly that the apartment now belonged to her. She made it evident that the apartment was hers to keep, reinforcing her independence. Unfortunately, this only added fuel to the fire, and Andrea's stepfather grew increasingly resentful, which Stone notes could have implications for their case. Ray adds that the stepfather's negative feelings towards Andrea were well known, highlighting a dark family dynamic that could be significant. Stone notes how Taylor, the stepfather, had a pattern of seeking out older women. Meanwhile, in the prison, as Nasir steps out of his room, he unexpectedly glances into Petey's room. To his shock, he finds Petey engaged in an intimate scene with one of Freddy's men. The sight leaves Nasir taken aback, feeling a mix of confusion and concern for what this could mean for him. The next day, while Nasir is taking a shower, he is startled when Freddy's man sneaks up from behind him. The man threatens Nasir, warning him that if he says anything about what he saw, it could lead to dire consequences. The threat hangs heavy in the air as he declares that he will kill Nasir if Freddy finds out about their secret. Nasir, feeling cornered, insists that he hasn't seen anything and knows nothing, hoping to defuse the situation. His heart races as he realizes how dangerous the prison environment is and how closely everyone is watching each other. In a different setting, Stone visits Taylor's gym. He observes Taylor training an elderly woman, noticing how he interacts with her. Taylor seems patient and attentive, displaying a different side of himself that contrasts with the ruthless persona he shows elsewhere. The next day, Helen calls in Nasir's old school sports coach for questioning. She asks him about the circumstances surrounding Nasir's transfer from the school. The coach reveals that Nasir didn't get along well with the other boys, which led to ongoing issues, prompting the school to transfer him. Chandra then presses the coach on the state of Muslim children in the school after September 11th, to which the coach admits that it was indeed difficult for them. He shares a troubling incident, revealing that Nasir had attacked 2 boys, sending one to the ICU. This revelation shocks Chandra, as she had only heard about 1 boy being involved. Feeling the weight of the information, Chandra struggles to formulate her questions but finds herself unable to voice any and quietly takes a seat, overwhelmed by the implications of what she's just heard. Helen shifts her focus to Amir, one of Nasir's friends from school. She asks him why he didn't accompany Nasir that night, and Amir explains that his brother had taken the car, leaving him unable to go to the party with Nasir. Then, Helen queries Amir about drugs circulating at the school, asking who was supplying them. Amir reluctantly names Nasir, claiming he charged $10 for 10 grams. When Helen asks Amir where Nasir got the drugs from, he explains that Nasir was prescribed steroids by a doctor and would share them with him. Amir recalls that Nasir often gave him the steroids during the midterms and finals, which raised serious concerns for Helen. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Helen questions Amir further about whether Nasir was truly running a business on the side and using drugs during exams. Amir becomes visibly anxious, unsure of how to respond. Helen presses on, trying to piece together the full picture of Nasir's activities, eager to uncover the truth behind his troubled past. The investigation deepens. After that, Helen calls in a government forensic expert to discuss the wounds on Nasir's hand. The expert confirms that the injury was inflicted by the same knife that killed Andrea, emphasizing the connection between Nasir and the crime. Chandra, probing further, asks if the wound could have resulted from broken glass instead. The expert asserts that this is unlikely, reinforcing the idea that the knife was indeed the weapon used in the attack. Helen then highlights that this same forensic expert had previously testified in a case where a verdict was delivered, leading to a conviction. However, when the case was taken to a higher court, a new forensic expert had to be hired due to issues with the previous testimony. This adds an extra layer of scrutiny to the current evidence. In response, Chandra mentions that she has hired another forensic expert to conduct a private examination. This expert presents compelling findings, noting that skin cells from Andrea were discovered on the knife Nasir allegedly picked up from the table. This crucial evidence indicates that both Andrea and Nasir were in close proximity to the knife during the altercation, which had gone unnoticed by the police. Chandra follows up by inquiring about the wounds on Nasir's hand. The expert clarifies that the injury is consistent with a glass shard rather than a sharp object, explaining that if it had been caused by a knife, the cut would have been much sharper. This points to the possibility that Nasir's injury could have happened during a struggle with broken glass instead. The expert also shares that they checked the back door of Andrea's house, which was unlocked that night, suggesting that someone could have entered from that route to commit the murder. Helen is intrigued by this lead and contemplates its implications. In a further line of questioning, Chandra asks why Andrea would choose the palm side of her hand during game, as many people instinctively use their opposite hand side in stressful situations. The expert explains that it's common for individuals under stress to react differently than expected, sometimes using their palm or hand side. Helen jumps in, questioning why Andrea didn't go to the emergency room after sustaining her injury. The forensic expert responds that patients who are very depressed or stressed often exhibit unusual behavior, which can lead them to neglect seeking help. This insight adds complexity to Andrea's state of mind and her decisions leading up to her death, emphasizing the mental health aspects intertwined with the case. The courtroom buzzes with tension as both sides grapple with the implications of the forensic evidence, deepening the mystery surrounding the tragic events of that night. Stone questions Nasir about his asthma, and Nasir explains that Box lifted him the inhaler from the scene because he was having an attack. This surprises Stone, as Box seemed to have tampered with evidence, especially given his seniority. The next day, Chandra summons Box to court. She asks how, as a senior officer, he could have altered evidence. Box explains that Nasir appeared extremely anxious, which prompted his actions. Chandra then probes deeper into their investigations, noting that they did not look into Mr. Day, even though he was involved in the argument that night. She highlights that Trevor was also not alone that evening, leaving Box speechless. Afterward, Stone follows Taylor and keeps a close eye on him. He decides to join Taylor's gym and starts asking questions about him around. Taylor, feeling threatened, warns Stone to stop prying, indicating that he might retaliate if Stone doesn't back off. Meanwhile, back in prison, as Nasir comes back from the hearing, he discovers that Petey has committed the unthinkable. Freddy is deeply shocked, realizing that something must have gone terribly wrong for Petey to take such a drastic step. This revelation hits Nasir hard, as it brings the grim realities of prison life. Later, Freddy visits Nasir's room, and Nasir shares everything that's been happening. The next day, Nasir devises a plan to distract the police officer, while Freddy takes the opportunity to confront his man that was assaulting Petey, leading him to commit the unthinkable. He cuts his neck with the blade. The tension in the prison escalates as the situation grows more dangerous for Nasir and Freddy. As Box is at his retirement party, he finds himself reflecting deeply on the ongoing case. He decides that, despite his impending exit from the force, he wants to remain neutral and continue his investigation into the troubling circumstances surrounding Andrea and Nasir. With a sense of urgency, he begins to dig into Andrea's past records and current whereabouts, motivated by the desire to uncover more information that might lead to the truth. While reviewing the CCTV footage again, Box notices something strange that had initially escaped his attention. He observes that Andrea seems to be looking back repeatedly while sitting in Nasir's car, and this behavior raises his suspicions about what really transpired during that fateful night. He can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story than meets the eye. Later, while examining the restaurant's CCTV footage, he sees Andrea engaged in a heated discussion with Ray, which increases his interest even further. It becomes increasingly clear that they were deep in conversation prior to Andrea getting into Nasir's car, and Box is determined to find out what they were discussing. To gather more relevant details, Box reaches out to a police officer friend to obtain Andrea's bank information, a move that he hopes will shed light on her financial dealings. After some persistence, he successfully acquires the necessary data. Armed with this new lead, he heads to a local casino where Ray is already present. When Box confronts Ray, he reminds him of a previous case where Ray had been involved in the brutal beating of a prostitute, bringing up painful memories. Box shares his intention to solve this complex case before his retirement, hinting that it might be intricately related to the current situation involving Andrea and Nasir. He presses Ray about how much money flows through Andrea's accounts, suggesting that it could tie back to their questionable dealings that night. Ray, taken aback, reveals that Andrea is indeed a client of his, indicating that there isn't much else to uncover in their relationship. However, Box has a few incriminating photos of Ray and Andrea that suggest their connection is much more complicated than Ray admits. He presses Ray further, hinting that the evidence they find could indicate a sexual relationship, as semen could potentially be found in Andrea's bedroom, linking Ray to the crime. Ray becomes defensive at this suggestion, claiming he was at his home that night, trying to deflect suspicion and protect his own interests. Box warns him that surveillance might reveal more than Ray is letting on, and the tension between them rises sharply. In a fit of anger, Ray suggests he should consult his lawyers, insisting that he might take legal action against Box if necessary. The confrontation reaches a boiling point, and Ray storms off, leaving Box with more questions and a renewed determination to uncover the truth behind Andrea and Ray's complex and seemingly questionable connection. Box knows that he must dig deeper to expose the layers of deception that surround this case before it's too late. After the tense encounter with Ray, Box meets with Helen to share everything he has uncovered in his investigation thus far. He outlines the various leads and evidence he has come across, emphasizing his doubts about Nasir's guilt. Helen listens carefully, but she expresses her frustration, stating that with everything they have, she can't simply start over. In her mind, the evidence strongly points to Nasir as the murderer. However, Box urges her to reconsider the possibility that Nasir might be innocent. His insistence causes Helen to pause and reflect, though her confidence begins to waver. Meanwhile, Chandra grows closer to Nasir, developing a bond that becomes evident as she shares intimate moments with him. In a surprising display of affection, she kisses him, clearly torn between her professional responsibilities and her feelings for him. During Helen's closing arguments in court, she struggles to maintain her composure. As she turns her gaze toward Nasir, she inadvertently refers to him as the murderer. The weight of her words hangs in the air, causing her to reconsider her stance. She's caught in a whirlwind of doubt, repeatedly questioning her initial conclusions. Box, sensing the gravity of the moment, stands up in the courtroom, drawing the attention of everyone present, including Helen and the judge, and leaves the courtroom. The unexpected interruption serves as a poignant reminder of the stakes involved, leading Helen to retreat into silence, overwhelmed by the implications of her accusations. The judge, having observed Chandra's kiss with Nasir, becomes concerned about her professional conduct. He calls her out for her unprofessional behavior and decides to remove her from the case, believing that her judgment may be compromised. This decision leaves Stone to take over as Nasir's representative in court. When Stone hears the judge's order, he is initially resistant, arguing that he is not prepared to take on this role. The judge insists that the time for closing arguments is imminent and that Stone must step in, leaving him no choice but to comply reluctantly. As Stone returns home to prepare his closing arguments, he suddenly suffers an allergic reaction due to the medication he has taken. The severity of his condition forces him to seek emergency treatment at the hospital, further complicating the situation. The unfolding events not only heighten the tension in the courtroom but also throw the entire case into disarray, leaving Nasir's fate hanging by a thread as key players face unexpected challenges. The next day in court, Stone begins his closing arguments. He explains that he had suffered from an allergic reaction the previous day, which is why he couldn't be present in court. However, he asserts that his absence doesn't affect his commitment to defending Nasir. He emphasizes that he sees genuine innocence in Nasir, pointing out that he has never encountered any issues with him in his previous cases. Stone notes the gravity of the situation, mentioning that several crimes occurred that night, including the troubling incident involving Nasir. He lists the events that transpired. First, Nasir had taken his dad's car without permission. Second, Andrea had purchased drugs. Third, she had handed Nasir a pill by the riverbank. Fourth, when they returned to her place, she gave him another pill. He describes how these drugs, especially when combined with alcohol, can knock a person out cold, much like how veterinarians use ketamine to sedate horses. Fifth, when Andrea's body was discovered, he had failed to report it to the police and instead fled the scene. Sixth, he made an illegal left turn, which led to him being pulled over by the police. Finally, seventh, he resisted arrest. Stone argues that he has substantial evidence for these crimes but reiterates that the prosecution's case against Nasir being charged for homicide lacks solid proof, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and speculation. He highlights the failure of the police to investigate anyone other than Nasir, which raises questions about the integrity of the investigation. The judge then instructs the jury to deliberate for 2 days on their decision. After this period, they return with a verdict. The jury announces they cannot reach a unanimous decision. There are 6 votes in favor of Nasir and 6 against him. Stone's heart races as he processes the implications of the jury's split. The judge acknowledges the jury's difficulty, but the jurors insist that they have thought it through carefully. The tension in the courtroom builds as everyone awaits the final verdict, so judge asks Helen, recognizing the complexities and challenges of the case, if she wanted to pursue it further, but she, after looking at the Nasir, decides not to pursue it any further. So, the judge finally declares that the charges against Nasir are dropped. Nasir feels a rush of relief and disbelief that he is freed. As Nasir walks out of the prison, he sees Salim waiting outside. Salim embraces him tightly, overwhelmed with joy that his son has finally been released. The bond between them strengthens as they share this emotional moment. The following day, Helen meets with Box. She tells him that she has a new assignment for him and that they should work together to track down Ray. Determined to make sense of the tangled web surrounding Andrea's case and the events that led to Nasir's arrest, they set out on their mission, hoping to uncover the truth and bring justice to light.